think I was going to say, we are going to start recording, and she has jumped ahead of me, the Zoom lady. Recording in progress. So welcome everyone to the Hot Topics for October. This is the League of Women Voters Nashville, in case you're thinking of someone somewhere else. Today we're going to be, our presentation will be from Reverend Stacy Rector, who's the Executive Director for Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And she will be leading us in a conversation about the failings of the death penalty system in general and why Tennessee should focus on alternatives to the death penalty, such as healing and crime prevention, investing in trauma-informed solutions that focus on accountability, supporting mental health programs, investing in early intervention and to prevent crime, and specifically providing victims of violence and their surviving families of murder victims the resources that they need to heal. Reverend Rector is a native of Dyersburg and a graduate of Dyersburg, Tennessee, a graduate of Rhodes College and Columbia Theological Seminary, and she is an ordained Presbyterian minister. She served as the associate pastor of Second Presbyterian Church in Nashville for 9 years and is currently active in the Presbytery of Middle Tennessee and serves on the Presbytery's Social Justice Committee. And in case I haven't said Presbytery correctly, I am happy to be.
You did it.
Oh, yes. In 2006, Reverend Rector became the executive director of Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And prior to that, in 2009, she served as a spiritual advisor to Steve Henley, an inmate who was on Tennessee's death row and who was executed in 2009. So with that, Reverend Rector, we're very happy to have you speak with us today and look forward to your talk.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. And I will just go ahead and say it. If my cat comes in here and becomes vocal, try to tune him out. He likes the attention, as any of you cat people may know. So just be ready for that in case. I'm really glad to be here with you today. And I was saying before everybody kind of hopped on that there's just so much to talk about. There's so much information I can share with you that I want to pace myself and share some chunks of information and then stop and take your questions if you have them and then move to the next thing. So I'm going to try to do that so that everybody can be thinking about the things you're curious about, want to ask, comments, all that good stuff. And before you hop off, I do have a couple things I do want to put in the chat for you to be able to check out. So I will do that before our hour is over. I appreciate very much, Karen, your introduction and reckoning with our continued work in trying to help people in Tennessee understand that alternatives to the death penalty aren't just the alternative sentences, although there are alternative sentences that people can be given, but the bigger alternative to the death penalty is how we are investing our resources and our energy in prevention and in supporting people who are at risk, ultimately, of becoming violent. And that's where we at TADP have recently expanded our mission. We've been doing this work beyond just talking about the death penalty for some time, but we've officially expanded to say we're not only seeking to honor life by abolishing the death penalty, but also by preventing violence and supporting those who experience harm. And that's harm both in the community and in the system. And so that broadening has really allowed us to bring in new partners, new conversations about how do we look more holistically at a whole ecosystem where public safety is the goal, right? Healing and public safety. And that's, I would say, a very different vision than the reality of our current legal system here in Tennessee, and in particular, the death penalty system. So I'm going to just kind of walk you through a few of the things that we at TADP talk about when we're talking about why we think the system is so broken. And again, I will just acknowledge I am a minister, and I come at this, come at this issue primarily from my faith perspective. That's where I was first really challenged by the issue of the death penalty. And I know many traditions have different positions on the death penalty, different understandings, different biblical interpretations. Different faiths have different understandings. But I think where I find a lot of common ground with this conversation is looking at the policy itself, not whether you believe it's justifiable or not justifiable, right or wrong, but does it actually do anything? What is it accomplishing for us as citizens, and what is it not accomplishing? And that's kind of where I really hone in, and we hone in at TDP. So I think we could all agree that the color of someone's skin, the amount of money in someone's bank account, their mental health status, their IQ, the county in which someone lives should not be determinative in whether someone lives or dies. Unfortunately, those factors are often more determinative of who gets a death penalty than the crime itself. I could give you crime statistics from around the state, and you could read about a lot of the violence that's going on, and it would be very hard for you to know which of those cases ultimately were death cases and which weren't, because so much of this is about poverty, race, mental health, intellectual disability, trauma, and the county that you live in. Obviously, that's not how we should be doing public policy. Those factors should not be the factors that are ultimately determining it, but too often that they are. A report came out this summer, and you're going to hear more about this in a little bit, from Death Penalty Information Center, which is an amazing resource. Death Penalty Info. It's nonpartisan. They just do research on the death penalty, and they did a report based on Tennessee. It's called The Legacy of Race in Tennessee's Contemporary Death Penalty. And they go back and really do a history lesson about where we've come from in Tennessee in terms of slavery, lynching into today, and how so many of these patterns and practices have changed over time and morphed into new, to look different than they were, but how they're connected. And one of those things is obviously the issue of race and the death penalty, which is one of these really arbitrary factors. And where we see that, honestly, most glaringly today is in the race of the victim. What we know is that 75% of those who've been executed in the modern era of the death penalty, and that would be from the early 70s to today, were executed for the murders of white people, even though white people make up only about half of all homicide victims. And that statistic tracks with Tennessee as well. We also know that Shelby County, which is a county that from, I believe, like 1877 to 1950 was in the top 25 counties for lynching in the country, that county has also produced 1/3 of all death sentences in Tennessee. It is responsible today for half of our death row, and for 60% of death sentences for Black defendants have come from that county. Those statistics are not unrelated. There is a culture, there is a climate that has continued on. And this report does a really amazing job of talking about that. It also mentions that Shelby County, in terms of its size, is an outlier nationally, ranking 3rd for counties of its size in the imposition of the death penalty. The numbers coming out of Shelby versus Davidson, it's 50% plus of our road comes out of Shelby. It's about 8 to 10% that come out of Davidson. That is all about the district attorney. That's all about the culture and kind of how the death penalty has been used historically. I'll give you some good news a little bit later about how some of this is changing, but in terms of this issue of fairness and who ends up getting the death penalty, all of this plays in. I want to speak about a couple more of these issues of where I see the system failing, and then I'm going to stop and let y'all ask questions. Another is, and I've alluded to it, is the amount of money we're spending on this. We are spending millions more to maintain the death penalty system than we would if we relied on alternative sentencing. Every state that's done a thorough, comprehensive study of the death penalty and its cost have found the same thing. From $1 million to $2 and $3 million more per case over the life of a case to have the death penalty than if you did not have it, right? And I can talk more about why that is, but those are dollars that we are not spending on mental and behavioral health in our state, on, I see Judge Calloway, on our young people who are just beginning to interface with the system, and what we could be doing to surround those young people with the resources that they need so that they someday don't end up as one of these statistics that I'm talking about, right? Victims, people who have been traumatized, people who have been impacted by violence directly in our communities that are not getting care for the trauma that they've gone through. All of these things that we know actually help to prevent future violence, we're not investing in so we can maintain the death penalty, which no evidence shows helps at all with public safety, right? So there's the financial costs, exorbitant financial costs that the state has with this penalty, as well as the human costs. And you obviously have the human cost of the people who are sitting on death row and their families, but the human cost to the families of those who have been murdered when a death sentence is given, where there should be some measure of legal finality at that point, right? You've gone through the trial. When a death sentence is given, that is the beginning of a process that will then go on in Tennessee 30 years. And regardless of what that family believes, they need or want in terms of the death penalty, what we know is being trapped in that process for decades is damaging for everybody. And again, finality could come much sooner with alternatives, and we could be spending those resources to support that family as they're walking through the trauma and the grief of what they've been through. And we're actually, and I'll talk more about this later, we're actually right now working with victims advocates in Tennessee to address the Criminal Injuries Compensation Fund, which is a fund in our state that is funded by fees and different things from the system, the legal system, that is supposed to be able in place to help families when there has been a violent crime, get support, get the help that they might need to bury their loved one, or for counseling, or for various things. What we have discovered is Tennessee is tied for 5th in states that deny that help to people. We have over a 60% denial rate for people in this state. And those are just the people who have figured out how to navigate the very complicated application process. So what we know is that we've got a lot of people out there impacted by violence who, regardless of the sentence that the offender has gotten, they are not able to access any kind of support from our state for the help that they need. And that's unacceptable. And so we want to work on that side of the equation as well to make sure those folks are getting help. Let me stop there before I go to my next part. Questions, thoughts, comments? I know it's a fire hose and I apologize. Anyone? I'm looking to see if I can see hands.
So, Stacy, we have one question in the chat, which is, and perhaps you're going to cover this, does the Tennessee Constitution have any language that can be used, intact right now to support ending the death penalty? Or is this a kind of a whole, not just who the Attorney General is, but is there language in our Constitution, much like, some states still had kind of that indentured servitude, slavery equivalent for jail sentencing that, is that the case in Tennessee as well?
We did change our language around slavery, except for the 13th Amendment issue, except for criminal punishment, right? That did recently change, thank goodness. That doesn't impact the death penalty per se. Obviously, Tennessee has had the death penalty for a very long time, since, maybe since statehood. We were early on one of the states that actually was one of the first states to change death sentencing not to be mandatory in some cases. Tennessee has kind of been somewhat ambivalent on the death penalty over the years, at least recent years, until the last few years. But no, there's not, to my knowledge, and Judge Calloway's here, and there's probably other attorneys, there would be no, I mean, we may, obviously the U.S. Supreme Court has cruel and unusual punishment as something that can't be meted out. The definition of that is obviously up for discussion, what that looks like, what that means. And thus far, the death penalty has been upheld as not violating the 8th Amendment on that front. So there's not much help in the Constitution of the state that I know of that would move folks to decide that we could get rid of the death penalty. There's lots of other ways to do it, obviously, but I don't think there's any constitutional language that necessarily helps us. Any other questions before I move on?
When you talk to state legislators, what do you find as far as their reasons for wanting to continue with the death penalty?
That's a great question, Carol. The good news is that we've been doing a lot of work over the last few years to really have a big tent for this issue and bringing in people from all backgrounds, all perspectives, and really working with our conservative friends and Republicans here in Tennessee and nationwide on this issue. And we actually have a woman who does conservative work, Jasmine Woodson's with Tennessee Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. And we've been doing that for almost 10 years. And so what we're seeing across the country is the conversation is changing, and conservatives are getting more concerned about the death penalty based on their own values, which is limited government, fiscal responsibility, and pro-life policies. The death penalty does not fit with any of those. And then you add what the victims' families go through, for decades. You're finding more and more people agreeing that regardless of the sort of their biblical or philosophical perspective about the death penalty, they don't believe government can or should be killing its citizens. And so that is shifting some of our conversations. But in terms of, those lawmakers we do have lawmakers here on the Republican side who are very close, or if not already there, on believing the death penalty is not working or appropriate. We just got to give them more courage and more support in their districts to actually talk more about that. But what I generally hear is the person deserves it, right? I mean, they deserve it. What they did was terrible. They deserve it. The victim's family wants it. We have to do this for the victim's family. And it will deter the next person from doing it. So, that those, and frankly, the deterrence argument, we can at least provide some evidence that actually the research shows no deterrent. I mean, it doesn't show anything. It basically shows it's a wash. You can't tell if there's any deterrent effect or not. It's just, it's so rarely used. Anecdotally, it's definitely not a deterrent, because states that don't have the death penalty generally have lower murder rates than states that do have the death penalty. So anecdotally, that doesn't make any sense. Certainly they deserve it. That's a, my argument with that is maybe they do, but the government can't do it. The government systems that are in place to do this are broken. they're not trustworthy, and they can't be the ones to decide it, right? And the last piece on the victims is part of the work we're doing is really empowering the voices of those families of murder victims who absolutely don't think the death penalty does anything to help them, and who want to see other remedies, other ways of doing the repair work after a murder has happened that are very different from, let's execute them. Particularly given the toll that takes on these families if they're trapped in this for 30 years. I mean, it's just, in any family I've ever talked to, whether they support the death penalty or don't, who's been through the process, says the process is horrible for them. And I think it is. Great question though. Other questions? It really is exciting. I mean, the trajectory is away from the death penalty. I mean, we're in right now politically, this tough on crime stuff has come back and it's out there, and that's obviously we're seeing our legislature moving toward more punitive stuff around juveniles, unfortunately, and others trying to pass stuff that I think is absolutely, all the evidence says that is not, it's wrongheaded. It's not what works. So we're in a little trough, if you will, of that sort of rhetoric and all that. But the trajectory that I see out there is that folks are understanding that the death penalty system is just antiquated. It's broken. It's not making us safer in any way, shape, or form. And it's not addressing the things that people really need to be addressed. And so you're seeing a state like Ohio that has a huge death row. I think it's like 130 on the death row in Ohio. Ohio has been an active death penalty state. They've used their death penalty quite often. They've got a Republican governor who, thankfully, when he became governor, said, you know what, the lethal injection stuff, I don't trust it. If we can't do this above board, we're not going to do it. So they haven't had executions there for a number of years, and they have bipartisan legislation to end it. And I think they're going to. I think Ohio's going to end the death penalty. And, it's a testament to the fact that on this issue, Democrats and Republicans can work together and have reasons to say this is not working. Whether they think it's people deserve it or don't, or that's not the question is, what is this policy giving us? What is it doing for us? And if it's failing us, and if it's not making us safer and not supporting victims, families, and not doing those things, then why are we doing it? Question, is there an industry that is dependent upon the death penalty that is difficult to dislodge? I would say no. I mean, all the death rows that I know of are they're in the state prisons. They're not connected to the private. And again, I would say that the money suck on the state is much greater than any cost, any money anybody's making off of it, right? Now that's a whole different thing when you're talking about incarceration for other, private prisons and all that stuff. But no, I mean, that's another fascinating thing about this is no one's really benefiting from it. I mean, I would argue even like, they're way more complicated cases to try. They're extremely difficult to win. In Tennessee, the most likely outcome of a death sentence is a reversal or an exoneration, not an execution. So there is this attachment to it that I think comes from history, culture, theology, and just basically the folks out in our communities not understanding all of these practical reasons that that this thing isn't working, right? And that's where our work to educate people and to get people out there telling their stories who are impacted, is so critical, because I think support for this is a mile wide and an inch deep. And once people really get educated, they can let it go. I mean, they may not become abolitionists, but they're not going to vote somebody out of office based on this issue. And that, I think, is where the rubber meets the road with a lot of our lawmakers. They know it's not working, and they don't honestly care that much about it, but they're so worried about being primaried on it, you know, or something like that, that's where we get hit up against the wall sometimes. So, you know, it's even polling in Tennessee. I mean, the polling nationally is some of the best it's ever been. It's the lowest support for the death penalty in 40 years. You know, it's 60% say they support the death penalty. In the 90s, it was like 85%. So that's dropped a lot. And if you ask the question differently, if you say, do you believe, would you prefer the death penalty, or would you prefer life without parole or a life sentence? Or you give people options, not just do you support the death penalty. When you give people options in the polling, the death penalty is no longer the majority answer. It's generally a different sentence. And in Tennessee, Vanderbilt did a poll a year or two ago that said 53% of Tennesseans prefer an alternative to the death penalty. So even here in a very conservative area, when people are given the question, this or one of these other things, they'll choose the other thing.
So as a follow-up is, I mean, the reason I was saying industry, it's like it's basically vested interest. So is there a whole group of lawyers who love doing this and, you know, whatever, but it sounds to me that they would have plenty. It's just not that.
Right.
Right.
They
So
would have plenty to do without.
And they'll be there. Yeah. Right. And even whatever. So, which is great. It's good to know. That means at least that. So the other question then would be, in Tennessee, moving forward with legislation and or an amendment to the Constitution, or in addition to the Constitution, such that the death penalty is not appropriate in Tennessee, which is the better route.
Yeah, I think the constitutional thing is probably because that ultimately goes to the voters. It's a referendum, and those are real hard for death penalty folks to win. Again, for this whole like if you know, it's more nuanced than just, do you support Tennessee having the death penalty or not? You know, and if you go there, you're going to get a much higher rate of support for it, as opposed to giving people the alternatives. And you know, so a constitutional referendum probably would not, and it's not necessary, because what you need is the legislature to just pass a bill that repeals the death penalty, and that's it. You know, the governor has the power to commute all the sentences on the row, to issue a moratorium. The governor has a lot of executive power to stop executions, but the governor alone could not just end the law. The law has to be changed by the legislature. Now, some states, there's been judicial decisions that have made the death penalty unconstitutional in a particular state, and that has stopped it, and the legislature has never fixed it, so that the death penalty just ends because of a judicial decision. But here in Tennessee, you know, at this point, the belief is that what we will have to do is ultimately get a bill passed that would repeal the death penalty. And we are not there at this point. There are things that are happening last session and this session that I think, you know, a lot of things that have been done are steps short of ending it, but have impacted who's getting the death sentence, how they're sentenced, all this. And for example, in 2021, there was a case, a guy named Purvis Payne, and many of you may have heard of Purvis. He was out of Shelby County. He has very strong innocence claims. Purvis also has intellectual disability. He'd been on death row for over 30 years. He had a date. He had gotten new attorneys through the capital habeas unit here in Middle Tennessee. They had been working very hard to get DNA tested. The DNA was tested, and ultimately it's so old that it wasn't. And Purvis had always said he went to help these people when he heard people crying. So the DNA was on like stuff in the house. It was whether or not he committed the crime. There was unknown male DNA there, but it just wasn't enough to get him a new hearing. What we knew is that Purvis wasn't alone in being someone with an intellectual disability sitting on death row who had never actually had a court to really consider that. And our language in Tennessee had a very antiquated definition of intellectual disability that wasn't medically sound, and also had really strict procedural obstacles for people to try to get back into court on that. And the Tennessee Disability Coalition, the Legislative Black Caucus, and others of us worked really hard in 2021 to update the definition of intellectual disability in the criminal code to reflect more accurately what it really is, and B, to provide a pathway for someone under certain circumstances to get back into court based on their intellectual disability claim. Purvis, thankfully, met all the criteria. He got back into court and was removed from death row. So a man who came within a month of being executed in 2020 after 30-something years on death row is now off death row and will be parole eligible in 4 more years. Since then, another man has been removed from death row based on intellectual disability. So, in other words, there are things we can do that help change who is on death row and how people get sent to death row, short of ending it. But all of this work we're doing is helping educate our legislature about why it ultimately needs to end. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, the League of Women Voters deals with voting, so we have an idea about some of these nibbling around the edges versus just saying, excuse me. I mean, there's a part of me that feels it's very simple,
Right.
which is a piece of legislation that says the death penalty is not an appropriate or will not be used in any way, shape, or form for anybody in any circumstance. Bada bing, bada boom. And then you deal with the fallout, so to speak, which means you look at all of the things that you've just been talking about. So in some ways, it seems which is one of the reasons I'm asking, can we get our judges to do it by looking at our Constitution and seeing that there's something about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or something in there so that you can't do it? No. Okay. Amendment. No. That's what you've just said. And also, it sounds to me like whatever piece of legislation comes up has to, I don't know does it have to fix everything underneath, or can it just say, stop it?
Yeah, it could. And part of the thought here is when we have a repeal bill, we want it to be viable. We don't just want to have a bill out there that's going to get every no vote except for maybe one Democrat. I mean, we don't want to come at this where we want to get to a point where when we have a repeal bill, it's going to move. It may get beat, but it's going to move. It's going to get Republican votes and it's going to get Democratic votes. Because the last thing we need, again, as years ago, is that this is all a Democratic liberal issue that Republicans don't care about. We're trying very hard to ensure that when a repeal bill is out there and is voted on, it's going to have Republican sponsors, it's going to have Democratic sponsors, it's going to have bipartisan support, even if it loses, right? Because otherwise, it's just basically looks like a losing proposition before it even gets out of the gate, right? And so that's part of why, we are creating a climate, we hope, to where eventually we will be ready to have run that bill. We're just not quite there yet. One of the bills that's out there that will come up next session, just so you all know, in addition to this victims compensation bill that we're working on to try to expand kind of who can access that money, another bill that's going to be out there is this bill around the secrecy on lethal injection. And like other states, Tennessee passed a confidentiality statute back in, I think it was 2013, that shielded any entity contracting with the state providing drugs to the state for executions from anybody knowing their identity. And what that has done, as you might imagine, is created a very shady process by which states are getting their hands on these drugs. almost all of the drug manufacturers have been clear. They do not want their drugs used for executions, and part of contracts pharmacies sign says they won't use drugs for this purpose. So what you end up getting are compounding pharmacies that are willing to play fast and loose with some of the obligations they have in their contracts to sell these drugs to states quietly under the radar in unmarked boxes, picked up in parking lots, so that and the attorneys and no one is allowed to know where those drugs are coming from. And so when Governor Lee stopped executions in 2022, and we give him lots of credit for that, an hour before Oscar Smith was set to die on April 21st, 2022, 1 hour prior, Governor Lee stopped his execution because he had been alerted that there was a problem with the protocol. It turns out there wasn't just a little problem with the protocol. The lawyers had been talking about this for years. And Governor Lee did he asked for a full report. He stopped 5 executions. What the report found out, I say a full report on a very small piece of the lethal injection process, but it was done well. And basically what they said was Tennessee Department of Corrections is not following its own protocol. The drugs are not being handled properly. The testing that was supposed to occur before these drugs were used was not happening. These drugs weren't being stored properly. People didn't know what they were supposed to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so much of this has to do with secrecy. The fact that part of this process is shielded in secrecy, and whenever the state doesn't want to talk about what it's doing, it defers to that law. So we've got 2 very conservative lawmakers, Senator Mark Pody and Representative Justin Lafferty, who are both very libertarian leaning. And they introduced a bill last session that basically said, you know what? Nope, we need to know the entity selling the drugs to the state of Tennessee. That needs to be public information. And that bill sailed through committee until our brand new commissioner of the TDOC from Arizona, who oversaw 3 botched executions in that state, said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. There will be no transparency around where we're getting these drugs. What we also know is that Arizona, to get their batch of pentobarbital, spent $1.5 million to buy a batch of pentobarbital. And it's another $500,000 just to compound it. And these are drugs we may or may not use, right? So this process is so shady. And we feel like one way to really talk to conservatives and Republicans about the death penalty is, look, if you're going to have it, it's got to be above board. You can't have this stuff being done secretly. And that is getting traction, right? And the more the state argues that it needs secrecy, the more some of these conservative Republicans are saying, what? Wait a minute. Why does this need to be secret? Does that make sense? So it's yet another inroad into talking about this stuff and getting people educated and maybe making our process more transparent, which would be a good thing. Any questions about any of that? Okay. I know this is a lot, y'all. It can get kind of in the weeds and complicated, but I guess what I want you to know is there is positive stuff happening, even as some of this rhetoric in our state has really ratcheted up on punishment. There's some positive conversations going on around sort of the death penalty and where we are. And I know I'm watching my time. A couple of things I do want to mention, and this is just for y'all's information because I find it so appalling that I feel I need to share it with everyone. But, the innocence thing is really, for most people, I think we can all agree, an innocent person should never be executed. This is just not okay. And in my mind, if there's a risk of that happening one time, that's enough to end the death penalty. Like, we have alternatives. So why are we taking that unnecessary risk, right? We're up to 190 plus people since 1972 that have been exonerated. That doesn't count people that, you know, were innocent but pled to a lesser charge or something like that. These are people that were absolutely not guilty, found not guilty, all charges were dropped, or a governor said that they were innocent. And we're over 190, which means that for every 8 executions we've had in this country since 1972, we've let somebody go because we were wrong. And those are just the people we figured it out. We've had 3 exonerees from Tennessee, 1 wrongfully convicted man who took an Alford plea, which allows him to maintain his innocence. Can't be counted as an exoneree, but he didn't commit the crime, but he took an Alford plea. So this thing with innocence is really, and it obviously is kind of a bipartisan concern, right? That you do not want innocent people executed. In 2022, a ruling came down from the U.S. Supreme Court called Shin v. Ramirez, and it was based on a case out of Arizona, a man named Barry Jones. And the good news is Barry is off death row. Since this has all happened, it's taken him decades. But at this time, he wasn't. At this time, Barry actually, I think, had an execution date. And the problem was Barry's attorneys, both at his trial and in his post-conviction, had been ineffective. And there was evidence that they had not pursued that could have shown a court that he did not commit this crime, right? But because of procedural reasons, he was unable to get that evidence heard, okay? And this is all about the procedure and how this can really be a problem. So this case gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in a 6-3 ruling, the U.S. Supreme Court determined that even though the court found his innocence claims persuasive, they were barred from doing anything about it, procedurally barred from doing anything about it. So Radley Balco, who used to write for the Washington Post and now has his own Substack thing he does, but he wrote about this, and the title of the article is "Guilt is Now Beside the Point." That was the title of the article. And this is the piece of this story that just honestly chilled me to the bone. Every court, and I'm reading from Radley Balco, to consider the actual merits of Barry Jones' innocence claim has ruled that he should never have been convicted of murder. Every court has ruled that. And every court to rule against him did so for procedural reasons, never considering the new evidence. Okay? If Jones is executed, it will not be because there is overwhelming evidence of his guilt. It will be because of a technicality. During oral arguments in 2021 in Arizona, Brun Royston of the Arizona Attorney General's office said something, as I just said, that ought to chill us to the bone. When a federal court is deciding whether it has the power to overturn a state conviction, okay, so the federal court, if the federal court has the power to overturn a state conviction, the Attorney General of Arizona's spokesperson or attorney that works for the Attorney General said, innocence isn't enough. He said it again for emphasis. Innocence isn't enough. And then he won. So for me, that should chill anyone that if our system has gotten to a point where procedure trumps the truth, I know we have to have procedures, don't get me wrong, but it has become an idol, in my opinion. And it is blocking people with true innocence claims and claims of intellectual disability and other things that are absolutely legitimate, that should have never allowed for them to end up on death row. It is allowing the courts to go, sorry, we can't do anything about that, sorry. It is unacceptable. Innocence isn't enough. So obviously, our system's got some problems. Let me switch just quick to the good news. Okay. I've told you about the polling. I've told you how that is moving in our direction. Tennessee, with all of our talk about punishment, we've sentenced 3 people to death since 2013. All of the people on our road, I mean, minus maybe 8, were sentenced in the 80s and 90s. Juries are not sentencing people to death in our state much anymore, if at all. Partly because of all the reasons you're hearing today, partly because prosecutors just aren't fooling with it. I mean, you know, it's a lot of work. And just recently in Sumner County, there was this case of Michael Cummins, the man who murdered 8 people up there, who had a terrible mental illness, who they were going to pursue death for. And the district attorney has just withdrawn that. And Michael has gotten consecutive life sentences. But I mean, this is probably the worst mass murder in the state, and he's not getting the death penalty. So then that begs the question, well, if he doesn't get it, why did somebody in Memphis who didn't even intend for anybody to get killed and someone died as a result of a felony, why is he on death row? You see what I mean? Like, this is when it really gets the arbitrariness, the just being struck by lightning is what when the court for a brief period said it was unconstitutional because of the arbitrariness. We're right there again and have been there, frankly. So there are things that are happening. 23 states now do not have the death penalty, including Virginia, a southern state that used it a lot. And if you add the states that haven't used it in the last 10 years, you have 37 states, plus the District of Columbia, that have not used it in law or practice in 10 years. It's becoming more and more and more of an outlier. And so this is all positive in terms of setting the stage for us to be able to finally get it done. But I will not lie to you all. People may die before then. You know, Governor Lee thankfully recently said that he is not in a hurry to resume executions, that they're going to do everything they can to ensure this protocol is transparent and legal. But the truth of the matter is, at any day, they could announce a new protocol, and there are a large number of people sitting on death row in Tennessee right now who've been out there for 30 years, who are at the end of the road, who have no more legal appeals. And, you know, Tennessee could see some really ugly days ahead before we finally end it. I hope that's not going to happen, and then we're going to do everything we can to keep that from happening. But I just want y'all to know that even if it happens, there is still movement to end the death penalty, and the sentencing and the polling and all that, that's all moving in the right direction. But we've got a death row from another era. We've got a death row from an era where we didn't have all the technology, we didn't have necessarily the resources, and we didn't even have the alternative sentencing that we have now. And so you got a lot of people sitting out there that would never be on death row today if they were sentenced right now. They would not be out there. So with that, I know it's a lot. I'll stop and see if y'all have questions. And I do want to put, yes, and go ahead. I'm going to put some stuff in the chat. I'm going to put our website, because I'd love for y'all to think about getting on, signing up to get our emails, because that's how you know what we're doing. And I'm also, hopefully it'll share, we are going to be doing a 6-week series at American Baptist College starting on October 13th on Fridays on this report about race and the death penalty in Tennessee. And we're going to have some dynamic speakers and conversations. It's going to be awesome. And I'm going to put the schedule for that, hopefully, in the chat. But please ask questions, thoughts, comments.
So one of the things that's happening is it's October and November, December is coming up. And in January, we have a new legislative session. And so I'm assuming if we signed up on your website, you would help us track anything that's we're doing to chip away, change, bring into alignment, remove,
Yes,
et cetera.
yes, 100%.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Hopefully I'm going to get this there. And then, yes, so we would absolutely keep you updated on anything that's going on actions to take, Day on the Hill, which we have every year, etc. So what have I done on here, y'all? I'm not a very good multitasker. You will see that as I'm trying to find all my tabs. See if this works, y'all. I don't know if that's going to work or not.
Baptist.
That, if it works, is the list of are y'all seeing it? Did it come up? The list of the stuff that's coming up at American Baptist, and we're going to be sharing it on social media, and we'll be getting it out on our emails too. But there's a lot of I'm excited about this series. I think it's going to be great, and we're going to record it. But October 13th, next week, it'll be myself and Tiana Herring, who wrote the report. She's coming to Tennessee to talk about it. And then we're going to have Ndume Olatushani, who is the man I referenced earlier, who took the Alford plea on death row, 20 years here, 28 years in prison, taught himself to paint on the row, and now is this incredible artist who exhibits all over the world. And he's going to have an exhibit on lynching. We're going to have Jamar Tisby, who's a New York Times bestselling author of The Color of Compromise. We're going to have Rafa Institute. So it's going to be great. It's going to be a lot of really, really great people. So wrongfully convicted people, Sabrina Butler-Smith, and some of the local folks who Tennessee Innocence Project has helped to set free in the last few years. So lots of good stuff coming up, but you'll know all about it via signing up for our list.
Great. So we have 5 minutes left. And does anybody have any final questions for Reverend Rector? Judge Holloway, would you like to add a comment?
I would love to add a comment. I can say, Reverend Rector. I think I usually call you Stacy, but I'll say Reverend
Stacy. No, Stacy.
I appreciate everything that you do and you all do for just fighting the death penalty. I'm 100%, if not 1,000% behind you all. I will continue to work as hard as I can on the prevention part. And I know that, starting down at my level in the juvenile court system, the school system, early and often doing the prevention work is the key. And so I will continue to help you out on this end. And then I can just say for everyone, if we continue to advocate to that legislature to support more programs to support our youth, not to put them in the adult system, not to take away the resources that we have, which is what they are going to try and do this legislature session. If we fight those laws and we put the more money towards youth on this side of the river, as well as mental health, our youth need so much mental health care that we just don't have it. If we can support that, and so all the money that we're spending with the death penalty and on places that we should not be spending it, if we just put it to our youth, then we can make the world a much better place. But Stacy, I appreciate you and appreciate all your work all over the years.
Thank you, Judge. Back at you. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to help people understand we're going to spend the money, but we'll spend it much more wisely and probably a lot less if we were investing it in these kids and in communities that need more opportunities and more care and more support. And if we were doing that and not locking everybody up and trying to execute people, we would have a much healthier state on all sorts of levels, right? And so Judge Calloway's doing such amazing work, and it's so exciting, and it gives us the evidence. It shows us the numbers. This is what is working, you know? So that's such a help to us. We want these lawmakers to be able to go back to their districts and say, yeah, I'm going to get rid of the death penalty, but here's what we're going to do for you instead. Here's how we're going to make our district safer. And here's the proof that it can be done. And that's all about Judge Calloway and her work.
Carol, did you have something?
Yeah. I'm curious really about how the representation that most of the people on death row had was provided for without them expending any money. In other words, it was people that were pro bono doing their cases originally.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixed bag, Carol. There are obviously public defenders and some really great public defenders in Tennessee. Y'all may have seen a story in the Tennessean like a week or so ago about the dismal amount of money folks, when there's a conflict with the public defender's office and folks get appointed, many lawyers actually lose money doing these cases.
That was part of the reason for my question.
Yeah. And public defenders are overworked, under-resourced in Tennessee. And, the common denominator for almost everybody on death row is poverty. And so you are people who do not have access to resources. They are totally dependent on the state to pay for their defense, their investigation, everything. And the lawyers have to ask for all that money. They have to go to the judges. They have to ask for it. They're many times told, no, you're not going to get that investigator. Nope, you're not going to get that. And so once you're given the death sentence, you have a direct appeal, then you go into state post-conviction. And there's some amazing lawyers doing that work, right? But they go back and begin to reinvestigate, and they begin to find all of the things that were never done at trial, either because the person maybe didn't really know how to do a death case, didn't have the resources to do the death case, didn't have the time to do it. And suddenly there's all these issues, right? So then you start having the appeals process, and then you move into the federal, where you get federal lawyers. All of this, by the way, except for the federal, is being paid by the state. So again, this is, you're talking about the amount of money that is being expended. And we have individuals in Tennessee who have literally had 3 capital trials. The most expensive, at least twice as expensive. It's like 50% more than a regular trial to have a capital trial. We have individuals who've had 3 capital trials and are not on death row today. So the state continues to invest all this money in trying to get this individual on death row, and they're not on death row. I mean, this is how that balloons, right? How that number gets so big.
Well, Reverend Rector, thank you so much for your talk today, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was wonderful. But whenever we have these sorts of things, it's like, it was a wonderful talk on a topic that. So yes, thank you. So just to ensure that you all keep up on this, the other for next month, we will be having someone talk about common sense gun legislation. It has been requested by many folk here in Middle Tennessee. So we will have someone be coming to talk with us about what's happening here in Tennessee in particular, and what is planned for the upcoming legislative session. So please come back to hear another part of our keeping ourselves in a position of safety and security, and maybe off on some places we shouldn't be, and trying to bring us back to some common sense in many ways. So we'll be doing that again in November. So thank you again, Reverend Rector, for this wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Great conversation. I appreciate it so much.
Okay.
Very informative.
Good, good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, good to see you.
You too.
So